November 17th, 1942. Somewhere above the jagged peaks of Kangshan Mountain, Yunnan Province, Captain James Sallee Browne gripped the controls of his Douglas C-47 Skytrain as the aircraft bucked violently through the dense cloud mass that shrouded the Himalayan peaks. The altimeter needle danced erratically, 12,000 feet, then 11,500, then climbing again as invisible mountain updrafts seized the twin-engine transport like a child's toy. Through the cockpit windows, Browne could see nothing but the grey-white wall of cloud that pilots had come to call cumulo-granitus, a sardonic reference to the granite peaks lurking somewhere in that impenetrable mist. The radio crackled with static, then fell silent. In the cargo hold behind him, precious supplies bound for the Chinese war effort shifted and groaned against their restraints. Browne had no way of knowing that in 69 years, mountaineer Clayton Kuhles would discover his aircraft's twisted aluminum remains scattered across a 13,000-foot ridge. The secrets of that final flight buried forever in the mountain's embrace. This was the reality of flying the Hump, the Allied nickname for the eastern end of the Himalayan mountains that became the most dangerous air route in military history. Between April 1942 and the end of World War II, this 550-mile aerial corridor over Burma and the Himalayas would claim nearly 600 American aircraft and the lives of approximately 1,059 personnel. The route earned its grim moniker, the aluminum trail, from the countless wreckage sites that marked its path, a metallic graveyard stretching across some of the world's most forbidding terrain. What began as a desperate military necessity, keeping China in the war against Japan, became an aviation nightmare that would haunt the mountains for decades to come. The genesis of the Hump operation lay in Japan's strategic stranglehold on China's supply lines. By early 1942, Japanese forces had successfully severed the Burma Road, China's primary land route for receiving Allied supplies and equipment. This left Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese forces dangerously isolated, their ability to continue resistance against the Japanese occupation hanging by a thread. The strategic implications were enormous, keeping China engaged in the war, tied down over 1 million Japanese troops who might otherwise be deployed against American forces in the Pacific theater. The solution, as desperate as it was audacious, was to establish an air bridge over the Himalayas, a route that would carry 650,000 tons of supplies into China between November 1941 and war's end, making it the largest and most extended strategic airlift in aviation history, until the Berlin airlift surpassed it in 1949. The men who flew this route were a mixture of military transport pilots from the United States Army Air Forces and civilian aviators from the China National Aviation Corporation, a joint venture between the Chinese government and Pan American Airways. Among them was Captain James Sallee Browne, known to his friends as Jimmy, whose Sihanouk Flight 60 would become one of hundreds of aircraft to vanish into the Himalayan wilderness. These pilots faced a challenge unlike any in aviation history, flying heavily loaded transport aircraft over terrain that reached 15,000 feet in altitude, through weather conditions that included violent turbulence, winds of 125 to 200 miles per hour, severe icing, and downdrafts capable of hurling aircraft earthward at what one pilot described as stupefying rates. The main obstacle was the Sansung Range, known to airmen as the High Hump or Rock Pile, where towering peaks disappeared into cloud masses that could conceal granite walls until the moment of impact. The aircraft themselves were ill-suited for such extreme conditions. Early in the operation, pilots flew Douglas C-47 Skytrains, the military version of the venerable DC-3 airliner. These twin-engine transports, while reliable at lower altitudes, struggled to climb high enough to clear the Himalayan peaks when fully loaded, forcing pilots to thread their way through dangerous mountain passes where a single navigational error could prove fatal. The Curtiss C-46 Commando, Introduced later in the operation, offered better high-altitude performance, but brought its own set of problems, including a tendency toward electrical fires and pressurization failures. Perhaps most notorious was the consolidated C-87 Liberator Express, a transport version of the B-24 bomber that crews dubbed an evil bastard contraption and a ground-loving bitch. The C-87's high accident rate stemmed from its inability to handle icing conditions. Pilots joked that it could not carry enough ice to chill a highball, and its tendency to spin out of control in even mild icing conditions. Navigation over the Hump was a primitive affair that relied more on dead reckoning and pilot intuition than modern instruments. Reliable charts were scarce, radio navigation aids virtually non-existent, and weather data limited to what pilots could observe through their cockpit windows. The China-Burma-India theater's low priority in the global war effort meant that spare parts and supplies were chronically short, forcing maintenance crews to send salvage teams into the Himalayan foothills to cannibalize parts from the numerous crash sites that dotted the route. These expeditions became grim treasure hunts, with mechanics picking through twisted aluminum and scattered cargo to find serviceable components for aircraft still flying the route. The weather itself seemed designed to destroy aircraft and kill airmen. Himalayan storms could develop with terrifying speed, transforming clear skies into walls of turbulence and ice within minutes. Pilots learned to read the subtle signs that preceded these meteorological ambushes. The way clouds built against the peaks, the shift in wind patterns, the sudden drop in temperature that signaled the approach of conditions that could tear an aircraft apart. In January 1945, a particularly fierce winter storm demonstrated the route's lethal potential when it increased westbound flight times by a full hour and caused 14 CNAC and Air Transport Command aircraft to be lost or written off in a single day. The storm's violence was such that aircraft simply vanished, swallowed by the mountain weather without so much as a distress call to mark their passing. Captain Browne's final flight exemplified the routine dangers that made the Hump the deadliest air route in military history. On that November morning in 1942, his C-47 departed from its base in Assam, India, carrying a mixed cargo of military supplies destined for Chinese forces. The flight plan called for a route over the Sansung Range to Kunming, China, a journey that should have taken approximately 4 hours under normal conditions. But conditions over the Hump were never normal. As Browne's aircraft climbed toward its cruising altitude, it entered the cloud mass that perpetually shrouded the highest peaks. Somewhere in that gray void, where granite walls rose invisibly through the mist and downdrafts could slam an aircraft into a mountainside. Without warning, CNA's Flight 60 simply disappeared. The search for missing aircraft became a futile ritual, repeated hundreds of times throughout the war. Ground-based rescue teams could rarely reach crash sites in the remote Himalayan terrain, and aerial searches were hampered by the same weather conditions that had claimed the missing aircraft in the first place. Most crashes occurred in areas so inaccessible that recovery was impossible, even when wreckage was spotted from the air. The mountains kept their secrets, holding the remains of aircraft and airmen in frozen silence that would last for decades. The psychological toll on surviving pilots was immense. Every flight over the Hump carried the knowledge that dozens of their colleagues had vanished along the same route, their aircraft absorbed into the mountain wilderness without trace. Pilots developed a gallows humor to cope with the constant threat of death, referring to the route as the aluminum trail, and joking about the cumulo-granitus clouds that concealed the peaks. But beneath the bravado lay a grim understanding that each mission might be their last, that the mountains below were littered with the remains of airmen who had made the same journey and never returned. The operational statistics of the Hump tell a story of staggering loss. Of the nearly 600 American aircraft that flew the route, 594 were lost, missing, or written off. a casualty rate that would be considered catastrophic in any military operation. The human cost was equally devastating. Approximately 1,659 personnel killed or missing, representing not just numbers, but individual tragedies like Captain Browne's disappearance. At the height of the operation, monthly aircraft losses sometimes reached 50% of all aircraft then in service along the route, a rate of attrition that would have grounded any operation not deemed absolutely essential to the war effort. The aircraft that did complete their missions carried a lifeline to Chinese resistance forces. The 650,000 tons of supplies transported over the Hump included everything from ammunition and medical supplies to fuel and spare parts for Chinese aircraft. This aerial bridge enabled China to maintain its resistance against Japanese occupation, tying down the million-plus Japanese troops that might otherwise have been deployed against American forces in the Pacific. The strategic value of the Hump operation was immense, but it came at a price measured in aluminum wreckage scattered across the Himalayas and the lives of nearly 1,700 airmen who never returned home. The end of World War II brought an end to the Hump operation, but the mountains retained their grim collection of aircraft and airmen. For decades, the crash sites remained undisturbed, preserved in the thin air and extreme cold of the high Himalayas. The aluminum trail became a frozen museum of aviation history, its exhibits scattered across peaks and valleys that few humans would ever visit. The families of missing airmen were left with uncertainty, their loved ones listed as missing in action with no grave to visit, no closure to ease their grief. It was not until the 21st century that modern technology and dedicated individuals began to unlock the secrets that the Himalayas had guarded for so long. Mountaineer Clayton Kuhles, founder of MIA Recovery's Inc., made it his personal mission to locate and identify lost American aircraft from the Hump operation. Using GPS technology, satellite imagery, and old-fashioned mountaineering skills, Kuhles began systematically searching the remote peaks and valleys where aircraft had vanished decades earlier. His efforts have located 22 crash sites so far, each discovery bringing closure to families who had waited generations for answers about their missing relatives. The discovery of Captain Browne's aircraft in 2011 exemplified both the promise and the frustration of these recovery efforts. Kuhles located the wreckage of Sianaka Flight 60 scattered across a ridge on Kangshan Mountain at an altitude of 13,000 feet. The twisted aluminum remains still recognizable as a C-47 transport after nearly 70 years in the mountains. The crash site told the story of the aircraft's final moments. The impact pattern suggested that Browne had been flying in cloud when his aircraft struck the ridge, probably while attempting to navigate through one of the mountain passes that offered the only safe route through the peaks. But the discovery also highlighted the ongoing challenges of recovery work in the Himalayas. In 2016, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs halted further investigation and recovery efforts at the site, declaring that at 13,000 feet, it was too dangerous to visit. Similar diplomatic and logistical challenges have hampered recovery efforts throughout the region. When Kuhles discovered the wreckage of a B-24 bomber nicknamed Pregnant Swan in 2008 in Arunachal Pradesh, India, the Indian government expelled the American recovery team shortly after the find, citing security concerns related to the long-standing border dispute between India and China over the remote state. These political complications have left many crash sites inaccessible, their secrets still buried in the mountains despite being located by modern search techniques. The recovery of a Curtiss C-46 Commando that crashed in January 1945 demonstrated the personal dimension of these search efforts. The aircraft, serial number 4296721, had been carrying 4 crew members and 9 passengers when it vanished during a routine supply flight. Decades later, the son of one of the passengers contacted Kuhles, hoping to learn the fate of his father, who had been listed as missing in action since 1945. The subsequent search and discovery of the wreckage provided answers that had eluded the family for 70 years, but also revealed the harsh reality of high-altitude crashes in the Himalayas. The aircraft had been completely destroyed on impact, its aluminum structure scattered across a remote mountainside where it would have been impossible for anyone to survive. These individual discoveries represent only a fraction of the aircraft still missing along the Hump route. Hundreds of crash sites remain undiscovered, their locations known only to the mountains that claimed them. Each represents not just a lost aircraft, but a human tragedy. Airmen who died far from home in service of a strategic objective that helped determine the outcome of World War II. The aluminum trail continues to yield its secrets slowly, one discovery at a time, as modern technology gradually penetrates the wilderness that has guarded these sites for 8 decades. The legacy of the Hump operation extends far beyond the immediate strategic objectives it achieved during World War II. General William H. Tunner, who commanded both the Hump airlift and the later Berlin airlift, recognized the broader implications of what had been accomplished over the Himalayas. After the Hump, he observed, those of us who had developed an expertise in air transportation knew that we could fly anything, anywhere, anytime. The lessons learned from flying the Hump about aircraft performance at extreme altitudes, weather navigation, cargo handling, and crew endurance would prove invaluable in subsequent airlift operations throughout the Cold War and beyond. The technological innovations developed for the Hump operation also had lasting impact on aviation. The challenges of high-altitude flight over the Himalayas drove improvements in aircraft pressurization, navigation equipment, and weather forecasting that would benefit both military and civilian aviation for decades to come. The experience of maintaining aircraft in remote, hostile environments led to advances in field maintenance techniques and parts logistics that would prove essential in later military operations around the world. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Hump lies in the human dimension of the operation. The airmen who flew this route demonstrated a level of courage and dedication that went far beyond normal military duty. They faced conditions that would have grounded civilian aviation indefinitely, flying day after day into weather and terrain that claimed the lives of their colleagues with ruthless regularity. Their sacrifice enabled China to remain in the war against Japan, tying down Japanese forces that might otherwise have been deployed against American troops in the Pacific theater. The strategic impact of their efforts helped shape the outcome of World War II. But the cost was measured in aluminum wreckage scattered across the Himalayas and nearly 1,700 lives lost in service of that objective. Today, memorials in China honor the sacrifice of the Hump flyers. In Guilin, the Flying Tiger Heritage Park occupies a former airfield used by American volunteer pilots fighting for China. The park displays a restored C-47 Skytrain named Buzz Buggy, identified as the last C-47 to fly the Hump route. This aircraft serves as a tangible reminder of the thousands of flights that crossed the Himalayas during the war, carrying the supplies that enabled Chinese resistance to continue. In Kunming, a monument stands to all Hump flyers, while a local hostel bears the name the Hump Hostel, in tribute to the pilots who died flying the route. These memorials represent more than historical curiosities. They acknowledge a debt that can never be fully repaid. The airmen who flew the Hump gave their lives to keep China in the war against fascism, their sacrifice contributing to the eventual Allied victory that shaped the modern world. The aluminum trail they left behind in the Himalayas stands as a testament to their courage, a metallic monument to the price of freedom that stretches across some of the world's most forbidding terrain. The mountains continue to guard their secrets, holding the remains of hundreds of aircraft and the stories of the men who flew them. Each crash site represents a moment frozen in time, the final seconds of a flight that began in hope and ended in tragedy. The last radio transmission from an aircraft about to vanish into the clouds. the impact that scattered aluminum and dreams across a remote mountainside. These sites are more than archaeological curiosities. They are sacred ground where young men died in service of a cause larger than themselves. As modern recovery efforts continue, each discovery brings both closure and renewed awareness of the price paid for victory in World War II. The twisted aluminum fragments that Clayton Kuhles and others have found scattered across Himalayan peaks tell stories of courage and sacrifice that deserve to be remembered. They remind us that freedom is never free, that the liberties we enjoy today were purchased with the lives of airmen who flew into the clouds over Burma and never returned. The Hump operation stands as one of the most dangerous and heroic chapters in aviation history, a testament to human courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The aluminum trail that marks its path across the Himalayas will endure long after the last veteran has passed away, a permanent reminder of the price of freedom and the courage of those who paid it. In the thin air above the world's highest mountains, where the wreckage of 600 aircraft lies scattered across peaks and valleys, the spirits of the Hump flyers continue their eternal patrol, guardians of the secrets that the mountains will never fully surrender. The legacy of Captain James Sallee Browne and the 1,658 other airmen who died flying. The Hump lives on in the freedom they helped secure, and the memories preserved in twisted aluminum scattered across the roof of the world. Their sacrifice reminds us that some missions are worth any price, that some causes justify the ultimate sacrifice, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to fly into the unknown despite that fear. The aluminum trail they left behind stands as their monument, a metallic testament to heroism that will endure as long as the mountains themselves. The stories emerging from the aluminum trail reveal not just the scale of the tragedy, but the intimate human details that statistics cannot capture. Among the wreckage discovered by modern recovery teams are personal effects that survived decades in the Himalayan wilderness. A pilot's watch stopped at the moment of impact. Photographs of sweethearts back home preserved in the dry mountain air. Letters never sent that speak of homesickness and determination. These artifacts transform abstract casualty figures into individual tragedies, each representing a life cut short in service of a strategic objective that seemed almost impossible to achieve. The China National Aviation Corporation pilots who flew alongside their American military counterparts brought a unique perspective to the Hump operation. Many were Chinese nationals who had trained in the United States or experienced aviators who had fled the Japanese occupation of eastern China. For them, flying the Hump was not just a military mission, but a lifeline to their homeland, a way to strike back against the forces that had driven them from their homes. Sihanouk pilots accounted for approximately 12% of the overall tonnage transported over the route, but their contribution went far beyond mere statistics. They possessed intimate knowledge of Chinese geography and weather patterns that proved invaluable in navigating the treacherous route, and their presence demonstrated the international character of the effort to keep China in the war. The maintenance crews who kept the Hump aircraft flying faced challenges that would have seemed insurmountable under normal circumstances. Working in primitive conditions at remote airfields in Assam, India, they performed miracles of improvisation and determination that kept aircraft operational despite chronic shortages of spare parts and equipment. When official supply channels failed, these mechanics organized expeditions into the Himalayan foothills to salvage usable components from crashed aircraft. These recovery missions were dangerous undertakings in their own right, requiring teams to trek through hostile terrain inhabited by tigers and other predators, often under threat of Japanese air attacks or encounters with enemy ground forces. The salvage expeditions revealed the full extent of the Hump's toll in ways that official casualty reports could not convey. Maintenance crews returning from crash sites described scenes of devastation that haunted them for years afterward. Aircraft torn apart by impact with granite peaks, cargo scattered across mountainsides, and the remains of airmen who had died far from home in service of their country. These expeditions also demonstrated the resourcefulness that characterized the Hump operation, as mechanics learned to identify which components might still be serviceable after surviving a crash and exposure to Himalayan weather conditions. The psychological impact of flying the Hump extended beyond the immediate stress of navigating dangerous terrain and weather. Pilots developed superstitions and rituals designed to ward off the fate that had claimed so many of their colleagues. Some carried lucky charms or refused to fly without specific items of clothing, while others developed elaborate pre-flight routines that they believed would ensure their safe return. The constant awareness of mortality created a unique camaraderie among Hump flyers, a brotherhood forged by shared danger and the knowledge that each mission might be their last. Letters and diary entries from Hump pilots reveal the mental strain of flying the route day after day, knowing that the odds of survival decreased with each mission. One pilot wrote to his wife, "Every time we take off, I wonder if this will be the flight that doesn't come back. The mountains are full of good men who thought the same thing." Another described the route as a graveyard with clouds for headstones, while a third noted that the aluminum trail gets longer every day and we're all just waiting for our turn to add to it. The weather over the Hump was not merely dangerous. It was actively malevolent in its unpredictability and violence. Pilots learned to read subtle atmospheric signs that preceded the formation of the massive storm systems that could develop within minutes over the Himalayan peaks. The interaction between the warm, moist air rising from the Indian plains and the cold, dry air masses over the high mountains created meteorological conditions unlike anything encountered in normal aviation operations. Downdrafts could exceed 3,000 feet per minute, capable of slamming a fully loaded transport aircraft into a mountainside before the pilot could react. Updrafts of similar violence could tear aircraft apart or hurl them to altitudes where the crew would lose consciousness from lack of oxygen. Ice formation presented another constant threat that could transform a routine flight into a death sentence within minutes. The Himalayan climate created conditions where aircraft could encounter severe icing at altitudes where they should have been above the freezing level, as supercooled water droplets in the clouds instantly froze upon contact with aircraft surfaces. The weight of accumulated ice could make aircraft uncontrollable, while ice formation on propellers and engine intakes could cause power loss at the worst possible moment. The notorious C-87 Liberator Express was particularly vulnerable to icing conditions, leading to its eventual withdrawal from Hump operations after a series of crashes attributed to ice-related control problems. Navigation over the Hump required skills that went far beyond normal instrument flying techniques. With radio navigation aids virtually non-existent and reliable charts scarce, pilots relied heavily on dead reckoning and pilotage, using visual landmarks when weather permitted and educated guesswork when it did not. The magnetic compass readings were unreliable due to the massive iron ore deposits in the Himalayan peaks, forcing navigators to compensate for variations that could change dramatically over short distances. Many aircraft were lost simply because they became disoriented in the cloud masses that perpetually shrouded the highest peaks, flying in circles until their fuel was exhausted or until they struck a mountain wall hidden in the mist. The cargo carried over the Hump represented the lifeline that kept Chinese resistance alive, but the nature of that cargo also added to the dangers faced by transport crews. Aviation gasoline, ammunition, and other volatile materials created fire and explosion hazards that could turn a survivable crash into an inferno. Medical supplies and food shipments, while less dangerous, were often packaged in ways that shifted during flight, affecting aircraft balance and control characteristics. The pressure to maximize cargo loads meant that aircraft were often operated at or beyond their design limits, reducing safety margins that were already minimal given the extreme operating conditions. The human cost of the Hump operation extended beyond the aircrew who died in crashes. ground personnel at the remote airfields in Assam faced constant threats from disease, Japanese air attacks, and the harsh climate of the region. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases claimed lives among support personnel, while Japanese bombing raids on the airfields killed ground crews and destroyed aircraft and facilities. The isolation of the bases meant that medical care was primitive and evacuation of seriously injured or ill personnel was often impossible due to weather conditions that grounded aircraft for days at a time. The strategic importance of the Hump operation became even more apparent as the war progressed, and intelligence reports revealed the full extent of Japanese forces tied down in China. By 1944, over 1.2 million Japanese troops were committed to the China theater, representing a significant portion of Japan's total military strength that might otherwise have been deployed against American forces in the Pacific. The supplies carried over the Hump enabled Chinese forces not only to maintain their resistance, but to launch limited offensive operations that further stretched Japanese resources and prevented the consolidation of their conquests. The technological lessons learned from the Hump operation influenced aircraft design and operational procedures for decades to come. The extreme altitude requirements led to improvements in aircraft pressurization systems and oxygen equipment that would prove essential for the development of high-altitude commercial aviation after the war. The navigation challenges drove advances in radio navigation technology and weather forecasting that would benefit both military and civilian aviation. The maintenance challenges faced in remote, hostile environments led to innovations in field maintenance techniques and logistics that would prove invaluable in subsequent military operations around the world. The international character of the Hump operation also had lasting diplomatic and strategic implications. The cooperation between American military pilots, Chinese civilian aviators, and British colonial authorities in India demonstrated the potential for Allied coordination that would prove essential in other theaters of the war. The relationships forged during the Hump operation influenced post-war aviation agreements and helped establish the foundation for international civil aviation organizations that continue to operate today. As the war neared its end, the Hump operation reached its peak efficiency, with aircraft crossing the Himalayas in a steady stream that delivered over 71,000 tons of supplies to China in July 1945 alone. This achievement represented the culmination of 3 years of learning, adaptation, and sacrifice that had transformed a desperate improvisation into a sophisticated logistical operation. The aluminum trail that marked the route's deadly toll had also become a pathway to victory, demonstrating that even the most dangerous obstacles could be overcome through courage, determination, and technological innovation. The final flights over the Hump in late 1945 carried a bittersweet significance for the surviving airmen who had flown the route throughout the war. The end of hostilities meant that the strategic objective had been achieved. China had remained in the war, Japanese forces had been tied down, and the Allied victory had been secured. But the cost had been enormous, measured not just in aircraft and supplies, but in the lives of nearly 1,500 airmen who had died to keep the aerial lifeline open. The last C-47 to fly the Hump, the aircraft now preserved as Buzz Buggy in the Flying Tiger Heritage Park, carried with it the memories of all those who had not returned, their sacrifice forever linked to the aluminum trail they had helped create. The post-war period brought new challenges for those seeking to honor the memory of the Hump flyers and recover the remains of missing airmen. The political upheaval in China following the communist victory in 1949 made access to crash sites in Chinese territory virtually impossible for decades. The remote location of most crash sites, combined with the extreme altitude and harsh weather conditions, meant that even when political access was available, recovery operations remained dangerous and expensive undertakings that required specialized equipment and expertise. The families of missing airmen faced decades of uncertainty, their loved ones listed as missing in action with no grave to visit and no definitive answers about their fate. The missing in action designation provided some hope that their relatives might still be alive, perhaps captured by enemy forces or stranded in remote areas. But as years passed without word, that hope gradually gave way to acceptance of loss without closure. The aluminum trail had claimed not only the lives of the airmen who flew it, but also inflicted lasting emotional wounds on the families they left behind. The gradual opening of China to Western visitors in the 1980s and 1990s created new opportunities for crash site investigation and recovery efforts, but also revealed the extent to which time and weather had affected the wreckage scattered across the Himalayas. Aircraft that had crashed at high altitude were often well preserved due to the cold, dry conditions, but those at lower elevations had been subject to decades of monsoon rains, temperature fluctuations, and scavenging by local populations who had salvaged aluminum and other materials for their own use. The recovery teams that began systematic searches in the 21st century found that some crash sites had been reduced to scattered fragments barely recognizable as aircraft wreckage. The work of Clayton Kuhles and other dedicated researchers has brought new understanding of the Hump operation and its human cost. But each discovery also raises new questions about the aircraft and airmen still missing. The 22 crash sites located so far represent only a fraction of the nearly 600 aircraft lost along the route, leaving hundreds of sites still undiscovered in the vast wilderness of the Himalayas. Each missing aircraft represents not just a historical mystery, but a family tragedy that remains unresolved. A story that ended somewhere in the mountains without witnesses or survivors to tell what happened in those final moments. The aluminum trail that gave the Hump its grim nickname continues to reveal its secrets slowly, one discovery at a time, as modern technology and dedicated individuals work to unlock the mysteries that the mountains have guarded for 8 decades. Each piece of wreckage recovered, each personal artifact discovered, each crash site located brings closure to families who have waited generations for answers about their missing relatives. But the trail also serves as a permanent reminder of the price of freedom, a metallic monument to courage and sacrifice that stretches across some of the world's most forbidding terrain. The legacy of the Hump operation extends far beyond the immediate strategic objectives it achieved during World War II, influencing everything from aircraft design and navigation technology to international aviation agreements and military logistics. But perhaps its most important legacy lies in the example it provides of human courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds, the willingness of ordinary men to risk everything in service of a cause larger than themselves. The aluminum trail they left behind stands as their monument, a testament to heroism that will endure as long as the mountains themselves, reminding future generations that freedom is never free and that some missions are worth any price.